You're also welcome to hold your questions and ask them orally. At this point, we're a small group, so we can be rather informal in that regard. But after our discussion, I'll close with a note about future WSN webinars. And if you have not already, please do add your info to the chat so that we can write to you and reach out in advance of each webinar to let you know about the upcoming ones. You probably already have a note that this webinar is being recorded. We'll clean it up a little bit. The chat will not be published, but eventually this whole recording will be published to the IAHR official YouTube channel, because we know that we have lots of members across time zones who can't tune in live to each of these sessions, depending what time they are. So without any further ado, I'll turn it over to Florence. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Amy. And I want to start by thanking the IHR and the Women's Scholars Network for giving us this opportunity to speak about this project. So it's very important for us to share some of the insights that we had, and also the process of working collaboratively in pandemic time, so to speak. So we'll say a little bit about that. So I'm Florence Page-Guignard. I'm an assistant professor in religious studies at the Faculty of Theology and Religious Studies at the Université Laval, which is located in Quebec City. I would say the project was somehow managed, located from my university. And this is also why we had also contributors who were my students, basically. But the project really is international because we are 4 co-researchers. And we worked, as Amy mentioned earlier, we worked across
I think we just lost Florence, and I assume she'll rejoin in a moment. I don't know if one of you wants to just pick up with a description of the collaboration before she does return, or if we want to pause and give her a moment.
Maybe let's give her a minute, and otherwise I can pitch in and talk a little bit about how we how we started. I mean, we've been collaborating for quite a few years before this. I mean, I think the first time we met was in Italy. No, well, I'm thinking Italy because of Julia, but it was in Germany, in Erfurt. And it was a symposium that Julia had organized. I think Julia and Florence, you already knew each other, had been working together, right? So we that's where we met with Sucharita, and we started collaborating then. So that gives you a little bit of it's quite a few years already, and so the idea of the collaboration is because we've been working in different fields, in different disciplines. There you are. So I'm going to give you I'm going to give it back to you, Florence.
Apologies, I have computer issues, just shut down without any notice. So I guess Pascal introduced the project a little bit. Again,
before the project I was at.
Oh, before the project. So yes, yeah. Indeed. And we can see more if you have questions about that at the end. What was really interesting is that we had met before, the 4 of us researchers, including at the AAR, and we worked collaboratively without ever meeting in person throughout the year. So I don't know if you explained the basic idea, the basic outcome, the output of this project that everyone can now visit on the website, and we can put maybe the address again on in the chat, is a series of interviews. We have about 10 videos that are between something like 28 to 45 or plus minutes with authors whom we identified as key contributors to this study, not just of gender or women and religion, but really of mothers, motherhood, maternal figures. So we approached some of these authors and we asked them if they agreed to be interviewed, and we recorded interviews. So we've done 2 or 3 each. And thus we have a series of 10 to 11 interviews. So one was in writing, and maybe Sucharita, you can say more about that one. what was really interesting is that we worked in several languages. So most interviews were conducted in English, but I've done one in French, and Giulia Petrucci has done 3 in Italian. So of course, this is not sufficient. We do not claim to be exhaustive or inclusive. We have, I would say, considered in our review of the field, of the review of the literature, more than, I would say, scholars working alone or focusing on only national context or in only one language have done. But of course, we would have had more contributors from other areas as well. So it was also selective in a sense, and we cannot claim that we've done it all, but at least we have some more perspectives represented in this project. So if it works, I'm gonna share one slide, and I'm not sure it's working now. Can you see the slide? Great.
Yes.
So very briefly, I want to share 3 things that I've learned from the project, from working collaboratively with my colleagues and from interviewing the authors whom we identified as key contributors. So the first thing that also colleagues of me have noticed is that it's strikingly a project in the digital humanities, but maybe not in the sense that we usually understand this new term like digital humanities. So many aspects that were, I would say, not my domain. So many technical aspects, also financial aspects, working with the AAR, converting everything so that we could pay my students in Canadian dollars, and so on. Also, that was to be taken into account. So many administrative aspects and the international aspects as well. We have used a variety of tools, and I can say more about that in the discussion if anyone is interested in ever doing such a project. What was a challenge, in my opinion, was to learn how to use some of these tools. So of course, by now, we all know how to use Zoom, except when the computer doesn't collaborate. But there were many other tools, like how to create the website, so WordPress, also using Vimeo to store the videos in the secure place. So we have chosen also not to use YouTube. And one thing that other scholars who would like to do such projects should be aware that it's not free. All of this has a cost. And this is why we are very grateful to the AAR for supporting us. So we have to pay for some of these tools. The free versions that you may find online, of course, are useful, but there are, I would say, many instances that are limited. On this note, on the technical note, I also want to say that I could not have done it because I was kind of managing the editing of the video without my students, without some students who knew exactly what to do, how to use these tools, how to edit the videos, how to cut, you know, the technical glitches and some sections of the interviews and things like that. So thank you to my students who really would have done a great job also in transcribing the interviews. So we have written versions. Originally, we planned on providing subtitles to all the videos to increase accessibility, but this would have raised the cost so much that we just could not have done it. So we have transcripts as PDFs for those who want to read the interviews rather than listen to them. So it's also possible. Another point, which is more on the things we've learned from listening to all the authors, and I would say I've learned that from listening to 2 of them whom I interviewed, and these were Professor Philippe Bourgeault from University of Geneva, and also Professor Francis Clooney from Harvard. And what was really interesting to me when I talked to them was that they made me aware of what is around the maternal figure. So very often when we think of mother goddesses, which was kind of the point of departure, but not an end per se, is that we focus on the maternal figure only, when in fact there's a whole universe of different figures around her. By this, I mean not only her children, but also companions, whether male companions, female companions, and even others. And we really ought to look at what is around the maternal figure, because they are often entangled in networks of relationships, both in texts, in narratives, in the mythology. And that's the case in ancient Greece. That's also the case in Hinduism, in Hindu narratives, but also in social life. So this is also why we could work together, the four of us. We had different perspectives, working both on text, on scriptures, on narratives, but also on social realities. And bringing all this together also made us aware of many points, including this one, that we should not focus only at the maternal figure, but that there are many other things and people and figures around her that we ought to also take into consideration. So the third point that I want to emphasize here very briefly is the utility and the usefulness of comparative research methods. But we ought to use them, as Oliver Freiberger wrote in his book on comparison, published recently at Oxford University Press. We have to do responsible comparison. So this project was not did not have as a goal to compare mothers in Hinduism, mothers in Buddhism, mothers in Islam, mothers in... This is not what we've done. We focused on certain themes when we had the discussion, and to some extent this is reflected in some of the interviews, maybe not all of them, but we wanted to have a comparatist perspective, which was mobilizing this data and these dynamics around motherhood and religion in many different contexts, not just to say, oh yeah, it's all the same everywhere, not at all, but to really take a critical distance from the religious readings themselves. And this is also what has helped us avoid what I call the trap of essentialism. Because when you come forward with such a topic, it would be very easy to fall into that trap and to go to definitions of mothers and motherhood that are very, very essentializing, and we did not want that. Another thing that comparativism has helped us achieve is to really understand what we meant more by matricentric feminism, by applying this perspective in different concepts. So as a reminder for those of you who may not be familiar with that concept, and you can go back to the work by Andrea O'Reilly and earlier to Adrienne Rich, Sarah Ruddick, and a few others whom we mentioned in the interviews quite a lot. It is not the same as maternalism. So it's not an ideology to promote motherhood, not at all. It's just a perspective that centers back to mothers, motherhood, maternal figures in a very broad sense in these various contexts. So we don't take motherhood as something natural, which is very often what we can see in the religious texts and narratives themselves. And we go back to Sarah Ruddick and consider mother as a verb, to mother, right? So it has a potential for helping us avoid this essentialist trap. And maybe others can say more about that, about mother work and to mother as a verb rather than as a substantive and a feminine substantive. This being said, we also recount through the discussions with many of the interviewees that embodiment still remains a key topic. So we are kind of walking a tightrope, and it's very interesting because the body's here, embodiment is very important, and yet we cannot bring back everything about motherhood to embodiment. It's not the only thing at stake here. There is much more than just gestation, pregnancy, fertility, childbirth, lactation, and so on. There's much more than that, and yet all of these topics remain important. What we also have seen through comparative work and through comparing our different disciplinary and national perspectives is that each subfield, whether it is, for instance, Buddhist studies, studies on Greek antiquity, studies on contemporary culture, each subfield has its own trends and its own ways of integrating key issues, key theories, both in gender studies and in motherhood studies. So I personally find that when I speak about this project, or when I present on topics on motherhood and religion, there is in fact a great openness to this type of topics in religious studies as a field, at religious studies conferences and so on. And it's sometimes a little bit more difficult to come forward with such topics in circles, in feminist gender studies circles. So that's something I've noticed, and maybe others have noticed that too. Of course, there may be exceptions to that as well, but it proved quite surprisingly easy to bring forward this topic at the AAR, through the workshops, through this project, through the many conferences. And you can see we have an events page on the website. So it was easier to do that in this way, rather than go to feminist studies conference and say, oh, we want to talk about motherhood and religion somehow. So we can see more about this in the discussion, but I want to hand it over to any of my co-researchers who would like to share more about their perspective.
Okay, I guess I can go ahead. Yeah, so, well, good morning again, everyone. My name is Pascal Engelmeyer, and I am an associate professor of religious studies at Carroll University. I'm in Wisconsin. We're having a bit of a weather event right now. It's, yeah, I don't know what it's like in Canada right now, but yeah, here it's pretty bad. So I wanted to talk a little bit about my more recent work, which has focused mostly on mothers, hence and mothering, so hence my position in this work. And in particular, I focus on the Pali Canon, so the text of Theravada Buddhism. And also, as Florence mentioned, using the work of Adrienne Rich, Sarah Ruddick, and Andrea O'Reilly. What I do in the context of Buddhist study is to propose a hermeneutic approach that recognizes the work of mothering as a valid and valuable Buddhist path, which is very much an outlier perspective in Buddhist studies and the study of women. So from, I thinking about the project that we worked on this past year, from a personal and professional perspective, to me, the great thing was to work with Florence, with Sucharita and Julia, even though we didn't actually get to meet in person for the last year. I mean, and almost nobody got to meet in person really in the last 2 years. But we still worked together. We still met via Zoom, which was kind of fun, trying to arrange the different time zones. And that proved really fruitful, because, as I think many of us know, working in academia, you can feel very isolated, because you're very often the only person in your on your campus working on a particular topic, and it often feels intellectually, but not just intellectually, I would say even personally isolating. So this was absolutely fantastic to have this small community where we'd gather once in a while and talk, communicate either by email, but also meeting via Zoom. So we continued this collaboration that we had started already quite a few years ago. And I mentioned this already, so I won't repeat it. And working together on a specific project, so kind of like bringing our different expertise together was really interesting. And yeah, I mean, I don't know, it's like from a personal perspective, there was something about it that I found really inspiring. Well, that's the word I'm looking for. And also to see how different people work, and watching the interviews was really great to see how we approach them very differently, the kind of questions we ask and how we interacted. It was fun to listen to the Italian interviews and brush up my Italian, so that was fun as well. So for my part, I interviewed 2 scholars. I interviewed Karen Darris for her article called Interpreting Buddhist Representations of Motherhood and Mothering, that was published in the Journal of Feminist Studies in Religion in 2014. And that was a very, very influential in the way I approached the topic of motherhood in Buddhist studies. And the second scholar I interviewed is Reiko Onuma. She wrote this book, Ties That Bind, Maternal Imagery and Discourse in Indian Buddhism, and that was published by Oxford University in 2012. So those two books, well, one article and one book, have very different approaches. So to me, it was a great opportunity to meet scholars, to have a conversation with them, because of course there's what was recorded and is on the website, which if you haven't seen it, it's really wonderful to hear those scholars talk about their work. But there's also the discussion before and after, right? That is not part of the recording, and that was also really, really useful and interesting. And what we see with those two scholars, right, is different approaches, which I think is crucial in particularly in my field in Buddhist studies. Is one sees motherhood as, in the Buddhist text, as a model for Buddhist virtues, but ultimately as a tie that bind, right? And that's Reiko Onuma, which sees that ultimately the particular relationships that the mother has with her child have to be relinquished in order to access the Buddhist path. And what on the contrary Karen Darris proposes is the opposite. They say, well, can't we see the experiences of mothering and motherhood as fodder for our spiritual growth? And so speaking with those two scholars and seeing how they kind of interacted intellectually was really, really inspiring also for me. So that's basically the crux of what I did here. And listening to the interviews, I can see there's themes that appear, especially when Florence mentioned already this tension between religious studies that is very interested in mothering, and then feminist scholarship, especially liberal feminism, that tend to see motherhood as almost something that we, as feminists, we should really not even engage in because it's too essentialist. And what we see is that a lot of the scholars are trying to find a way to still address, which a crucial part of human experience, and in particular of women's experience, to approach it in a way that is that does away with the essentialism, but also recognizes the embodiment of the process. So yeah, that's it for me.
Okay, I'll speak now. I hope I'm audible because I'm really, really far away from the rest of you. I'm from Mumbai, and it's evening. So good evening to all of you. And I'll say firstly that I do not belong to religious studies scholarship. I am from English literature. Awesome. So I share. I mean, there is immediately something for me which is very new, in a collaboration with 3 scholars with religious studies backgrounds. When they speak of texts, and since I deal mostly with Hindu mothers, so when I speak of Hindu texts, I do not, because I am not very conversant with Sanskrit, so I do not have the knowledge which comes from reading the text itself. But since I've grown up in a Hindu household, I kind of look at it from the point of view of a person on whom the text has impacted, on whom the goddesses we talk about. So I will not be able to talk of Durga from the point of view of the Devi Mahatma, where she is, I have read translations, but I will be more able to relate to Durga as a goddess I have grown up with, or, as I have worshipped, or as my family or friends have worshipped, or do worship. And I don't, but they do. So immediately my perspective is a different one. And this does not mean that India does not have religious studies scholarship. When I was searching for authors to interview, I searched around at different, universities, and there are around 50 programs like master's programs on religious scholarship in different parts of India. So that's a reasonably large number, I feel. And of course, there are numerous more departments which study women or gender studies, and that's one of the most popular programs right now in India. But the point is, they hardly ever come together. So they are very, there's very little work done on the intersection of motherhood and religion, which is very surprising because religion is, it kind of suffuses life in India so very deeply that it, and motherhood is such a kind of venerated uh, ideology in India that it's very, it was such a glaring absence to me that these do not come together more frequently than it has done. So we kind of were talking about it, and I think Florence wrote it in one of her mails, and I completely agree that there is this complete conflation of the category of woman with mother in India, which is why even if there is work about women's roles in Hinduism, it's about women's roles in general, not specifically about mothers. So there might be scholars like Mandakranta Bose who has written about, a very, very interesting book on women's roles and rules and regulations in Hinduism. But it doesn't just focus on mothers. So, and even feminist studies or works written by feminists in India also focus, if they focus on maternal issues at all, they focus on more what they like to call contemporary problems like surrogacy or, issues of abortion, issues of maternity leave and, conditions of working mothers of that sort, but they do not, again, connect it with, they do not connect mother goddesses and mothers in that way. So one of the first books which actually does that, and it was kind of, it's one of the most well-known books about mothers from India. And I wanted to focus on authors located in India, not in the diaspora, because there have been diaspora writers like Mandakranta Bose, for example, who've been working on this a bit. Is by Maitreyi Krishnaraj. It's edited by her. And this is also one thing I noticed, that most of the books on motherhood are anthologies with multiple contributors rather than solo authored books, except for the ones I actually interviewed. So Maitreyi Krishnaraj is one of those pioneering scholars of motherhood, but she is also not from religious studies. She is a sociologist. And her book if I remember correctly, is one of the first books which kind of points out this gap between the treatment of mother goddesses and the lived realities of mothers in India. So in fact, the book is titled Motherhood in India, Glorification Without Empowerment. So when I approached her for an interview, she refused to appear in a kind of video interview because she's actually over 90 years old now and she has hearing problems. So she very kindly agreed to do an email interview, which is published on the website as a, it's a written interview published there. But even there, she talks about how this is just one area in her entire, research focus. So it's not just this area which she focuses on. So, but this was one of the books. And in fact, there are several authors in this book, which I actually wanted to interview because especially there's this historian, Shukumari Bhattacharya, who has this very, very interesting chapter here about how Hindu texts limit the role of mothers in the upbringing of the children, and it actually quotes from a lot of Hindu texts to show how mothers have been subjugated in the texts and in a very limited capacity as child bearers rather than, people who actually have a significant role in the upbringing of their children. So, but again, she is also no longer alive. And another very pioneering author who actually wrote a book about motherhood is Yashodhara Bagchi, and this is the book this you can see is a very truncated book. She passed away while she was writing this. So it's just basically whatever she had managed to write before her passing away. So it was like a gap. So who could I interview? That became a kind of a challenge. And then the authors whom I did interview, one is Amrita Nandi. She's an independent scholar. She has a very interesting book called Motherhood and Choice, and I interviewed her. But the book itself is not just on motherhood and religion. It covers a very wide range of perspectives on motherhood, especially about the aspect of motherhood being a choice. So she has sections on voluntary non-mothers and on non-voluntary mothers like surrogates, and she shows how her section on religion and motherhood is basically about how religion normalizes only one kind of heteronormative, familial role for mothers, and it has to be within that. Anything outside that is not acceptable, and that kind of non-acceptance has a lot of religious backing. So that is important. That's what she points out in her book. And the other authors, in fact, it's a jointly written book whom I interviewed, Anu Aneja and Shubhangi Vaidya, who wrote a book called Embodying Motherhood. They have an entire chapter on how goddess iconography has shaped mothers. And they have this very interesting they raise this very interesting point that the more powerful goddesses in the Hindu pantheon are actually not mothers. They are mother goddesses because all goddesses are referred to as mother goddesses, but they are the more divine ones like Kali or Durga in her, avenger avatar, you can say, or somebody like Saraswati. So they are creators and destroyers in a different sense. And the ones who are mothers are actually the domesticated ones. So they kind of bring it down to this point that the mothers are the silent ones, and the more powerful mother goddesses are the ones who speak. So they relate the metaphor of motherhood to the creation, not only of children, but to the creation of words. So that's another kind of mothering or motherhood they are talking about in this book. And I found it a kind of interesting take, because when I interviewed them, even in the interview, they talked about the book being a kind of, as the product of a very creative and combined or a collaborative reproductive process between the two of them. So that, opens up new areas which I had not myself thought about before. So I definitely learned a lot, not just from my interviews with them, but also from working with all my other collaborators. For example, from Pascal, I got another completely different view of motherhood being, perceived in a different way or conceived in a different way in Buddhist texts, which is also born in Indian soil, but has a different take on motherhood as compared to the traditional Hindu texts. From Julia, I learned about male figures, in ancient Greek religions, who are shown in, motherhood roles or in motherhood positions. So these were all very interesting to me. As I said, I don't come from a religious studies background. So from a comparative point of view, which Florence has been talking about, it seems interesting, and it also seems a kind of a line which we can take in the future, because India is it's a multi-religious country. And so even if we focus on, say, everyday practices of mothers, so we can fruitfully compare the everyday practices of Hindu mothers, as opposed to, because right now there is a very predominantly Hindutva ideology which is dominating the motherhood discourse in India. So there are very few, but there are a few works by Muslim mothers in India as to how difficult it is for them to practice Islam, or to kind of pass on Islamic values to their children in such a hostile terrain. So I study motherhood from this perspective, from the perspective of everyday religious practices. So for me, it seems that there is a lot to be done, and a lot which can be done either through collaboration or by other scholars. So although we did focus on books written by scholars, there are many more books to be written and articles to be, thought up, that this actually has excited me so much. Thank you for listening to me. Julia.
Hi, I'm the last one. I will keep it really short. My name is Giulia Pedrucci. I am a postdoctoral scholar, and I have this scholarship from the Gerda Egg Stiftung in Germany. But I also teach at the University of Verona in Italy as a adjunct professor, and I teach history of religions, what we call history of religions. We don't call it religious studies. And so I really appreciate what Pascal said about being isolated in academia. I'm very, very isolated, let's say so. And in fact, when Florence, okay, I have the cat that just. When Florence contacted me with this project, and I was asked to interview some scholars in Italy who worked with religious study and motherhood study, I was like, okay, yes, I like it, but who? I mean, in Italy, no one is even aware of motherhood studies are, so I was really worried, but at the end, I came up with 3 names, namely Massimo Cutraro, an archaeologist, and Silvia Romani, a philologist, a classical philologist, and Roberta Franchi, a philologist as well, but she deals with literature, Christian literature, while Silvia Romani deals, like me, more with Greek and Roman mythology. Yes, I forgot to say this. My field of study is ancient Greek and Roman religions. And so I was kind of very surprised, nicely surprised by the fact that all these 3 scholars, and I repeat, only Massimo Cutraro is an archaeologist, the other 2 are 2 philologists, agreed that archaeology is too neglected in religious studies, and especially if we deal with ancient cultures, we do have to consider what we call the materiality of religion. We do need to consider more archaeology, and and this is kind of, as I said, surprising. Because in Italy, in history of religions is based mainly, I would say, almost exclusively on sacred text, literary text, and this is, to me, it's a big limit. And so this is the most important thing I have to say, I think, about my experience in interviewing scholars from Italy. I would add the fact that it was kind of very interesting to see how archaic and long-lasting are some stereotypes about motherhood. And for example, the Mater Dolorosa, the suffering mother. Or, for example, on the other hand, the mother was willing to see her child die as a martyr. So how willing and enthusiastic she is for this. And last but not least, I would like to mention how many maternal figures we can find in Christian literature, as Roberta Franchi showed us. It's always all about Mary, but we have plenty of other maternal figures that deserve to be investigated in Christian literature. And here I stop because it's kind of late, and I think I said all the important thing I had to say.
So thank you to the 4 of you for those really interesting and rich distillations of what is a much more broad and sprawling project than we have time to go into the details of. I might just let you all, and maybe Florence, you want to do this, handle your own questions. And if there aren't immediate questions, you can also respond to things that other presenters have shared with us. So the floor is open. You're welcome to unmute yourself and ask questions rather than even using the raise hand function, because we're such a small group. I think that will work fine. But Florence, I'll put you in charge.
Okay, thank you so much. So there was one question by Rosalind Hackett, who unfortunately had to leave. And she asked us if we had contacts with African scholars. So we had one, but really late in the project. So we could not include this contact into the interviews. But again, we absolutely cannot claim to be exhaustive, and that would have been very interesting because no one of us works on African traditions. I have students who do, but I personally don't. It's not my area, but every time I listen to someone who works on these topics, I learn a lot, again, from comparison, from some topics that emerge that really makes us think differently. So so the answer briefly is yes, but too late. But again, maybe we'll have another iteration of this project later if we get some more time and energy and funding, because again, that costs lots of money to prepare, to edit the videos. But yeah, we would have loved to have other perspectives on motherhood in again, it must be very specific. We cannot say mothers in Africa would make no sense. It would have to be very localized in a specific culture, specific group, specific tradition, and also other areas as well. So I don't know if anyone else wants to add something.
If I could add something.
Yes.
I just want to mention that Oriaronke Oladipo, a Yoruba scholar, her book will be out soon, Women in Yoruba Religions. It'll be in the Women in Religions series at New York University Press. And I had the privilege of editing that book with her. And I learned a lot about Yoruba culture and also about Yoruba goddesses. And she was stressing the importance of motherhood in Yoruba culture as a source of power. And it's a type of motherhood it's a concept of motherhood that does not limit women to solely being mothers. That was one thing that I found very interesting. And so I would recommend Oriaronke Oladipo if you're not already in touch with her. But that was my next question is, what do you think? Oh, and I just want to thank you. This has been very informative, and thank you for your research, and I'll be watching the interviews with great interest. So I've appreciated this presentation. But what do you plan to do next? Or does it depend on funding?
I can answer to that. So yes, it all depends on funding and freeing up time for this. What would be amazing is to be able to take the transcripts of the interviews, which we have, and we have them all in English. So we got them translated from French into English, from Italian into English. And if we could work this text a little bit, and of course, ask for the interviewee's permission to be published in writing, we'd love to have an edited book with the series. But again, this will depend if we get a publisher and funding, because it's quite unusual, I would say, these days. Of course, there are many edited volumes, but it's quite unusual to have collaborative works such as ours. So very concretely, what we ought to do if we do that is we have to add an introduction. And this introduction would reflect all the preliminary work that we've done before proceeding to selecting the authors and conduct the interviews. And that is an extended literary review, a state of the field. And we're not starting from scratch. We're not starting from zero. Of course, we build up on all the scholarship on gender and religion, on women and religion, but we try to dig in a little bit deeper, a little bit more precisely into the maternal and the religious, which has not been done before, at least not to the extent that we know, and not with the labels that we're using, because we are aware that, yes, there are lots of work on kinship networks and systems within religion, parenting to some extent, like the family structures and so on. So all of this exists, but it's very rarely labeled as motherhood, maternal, mothers only, again, because of this equation, which we try to deconstruct. Woman equals mother equals women, right? And we are looking at this in a very critical view. Of course, it's true in some instances, but it's not always the only equation that exists. And we try to bring up this other domain. So that's what we would do, I guess, if we publish a book on that, is to collect the interviews, rephrase some of these sections. There are also sections, I give you one example. So one of the questions that we all agreed we would try to ask the interviewees, and sometimes we could, sometimes we couldn't, is as follows: if you had younger scholars, PhD students, graduate students who want to try and take up a new topic around motherhood and religion, what would you advise? Which topics in your field, in your subfield, would you advise that they focus on? And we get really great answers on that. We got confirmation that indeed it's a topic which has potential for graduate students to work on within feminist frameworks, within religious studies, even within theology. And that's something we could add back again into the book, which in some instances we had to cut out of the interviews because they were quite long. So if anyone else wants to add something to that question, what should we do with the project?
I think maybe a conference that would bring, you know, some of the scholars that we interviewed, but also others that we could not interview because we, again, you know, limited funding. And yeah, that's an idea, I think.
Yeah, even a sort of add-on to an existing conference, like a workshop or a symposium. The South Asia conference that I go to every October has a pre-day where you can organize thematic symposiums, and then those often generate edited volumes and further collaborations. It's a really good model.
Yeah, we do actually. We have organized 2 already pre-conference workshops with the AAR. So we had one this year, well, last year and the year before, and that was online because of the situation, of course. And we have also requested to do a third one this year, that should be in person. So we have already you know, started doing this and kind of like bringing people together on this topic. And as you know, Florence mentioned, it proves to be really successful, and there's a lot of interest in it. Again, more from the religious studies perspective, I would think that, you know, from the more like kind of traditional like liberal feminism.
I think that we already have some kind of follow-up. If you look at the events page, you will find a list of not only the workshops that Pascal and myself have suggested that we do at the AAR, but also other things that, for instance, Julia has organized a conference on, if I'm not mistaken, the title is Mothers in the Time of the Church Fathers. Yes. Right? So that's on antiquity. I wish I could have attended the sessions. Unfortunately, I could not. But even if I no longer work that much on antiquity, but it's always interesting to listen to what the trends are, who is working on what. And as for myself, I've organized one on mothers and maternal figures in South Asian traditions. So we had perspectives on Sikhism, Buddhism, and of course, again, diverse expressions of Hinduism, as well as Hindu practices and traditions in contact with the West. So it's still ongoing, and you can still attend the session today if you want to, or next week we'll have a roundtable on commercial surrogacy in India, and Sucharita will be speaking as well in this roundtable. So yes, there are like follow-up events and ideas. And it's always interesting to see how scholarship itself is structured. If you look at the AAR, for instance, there's a unit on death and dying. There is no unit on birth and birthing or childbirth. if you look at the Encyclopedia of Religion, the second version, the revised version, there is an entry on monkeys, and you can read an analysis of narratives about Hanuman and other things like that. There's an entry on monks. There's an entry on Dietrich Bonhoeffer, the theologian, but there is no entry on mothers. There is like a section, a very huge section, like 16 pages on gender, of course, but even within that section, there's not a lot on mothers. So there is space to do something, maybe a companion, you know, these companion volumes, companion to motherhood and religion, something like that.
I'm just to add, you know, wood to the fire here. I was recently looking at the 2 volumes that came out on women in Buddhism that were published, and I mean, one of them there's not even an entry on mothers in the index, and in the other, the couple of entries, there's 2 entries. Well, there's 1 entry and there's 2 references in the index, and there's no discussion at all of mothers, except to say that, well, mothers, you know, is kind of a big no-no, basically. So it seems like there's no, you have texts on women in Buddhism that have no reference to mothers, as if mothers did not exist in Buddhism. And when we think about the crucial role that mothers play in not just in the text, but in contemporary life in Buddhism, there's definitely something missing. So that kind of supports what Florence is saying, that this almost like women cannot exist as mothers if we look at it from this perspective.
So if I could just ask something, or actually I was planning to ask maybe Sucharita or others, but now that I've been scrolling through this conference program, I see that it's addressed in part by Matthew Boiver's paper. But I was thinking about, you know, what in Tamil Nadu we call Aravani or Tirunangai communities. Here in his abstract, he's talking about hijras. And expanded or alternative or inverted forms of maternality and motherhood. Also in the kinship structures of a lot of these communities, and the kind of alternative framings of what constitutes a family, birth or otherwise, would be a really exciting set of directions. There's still obviously a ton of work to be done in those areas.
Yes, absolutely. Because yeah, exactly. But because in Hinduism, it's actually very difficult to say this is Hinduism, because there is like so many multiple versions of it. So hijra, the alternative or kinds of mothering that we see in communities which are non-normative, like the hijra community, or even there's this chapter on in Amrita Nandi's book about sex workers who want to be mothers, or women who adopt children, or queer mothers, or single women who want to be mothers. So these are all there's so many possibilities, not just traditionally like the hijra communities, but also in more modern iterations, like single working women who don't want to marry but still want to adopt children. So the point is that the bias against them which exists is partially because of those textual, the kind of idealizations of the heteronormative motherhood. And it's also interesting because there are so many divine kinds of mothering which are hidden in the texts, or which are there, but which are not the ones which are kind of popularized by the priests or by what I would call the Hindutva discourse. For example, Kali, for example, is completely overshadowed in, I mean, they don't even talk about her, but although I come from that part of India, Bengal, where Kali is very much worshipped, but the mainstream Hindutva discourse, which is, as I said, dominating right now, is more focused on Ram and Sita and that kind of, ideal heteronormative family. So yes, there are within Hinduism, within these kind of gradually overshadowed versions or or iterations of Hinduism, there are so many possibilities which can be empowering, can be inclusive. But if you see Hinduism as a religion, as a kind of a living shifting kind of a narrative or a discourse. You will see how there are like power struggles within these different kinds of narratives. And yes, there's so much of scope there. You are right, Amy. And although I am not very familiar with Tamil, I know there are areas in Tamil Nadu where you have families which are the matrilineal rather than patrilineal, right? There are communities in Kurg, for example, which have a matrilineal kinship structure. So there are so many possibilities.
Yeah, and also in Kerala, as well as the Tamil areas of Sri Lanka, like Badaklo, etc. Dennis McGilvray has written a lot about those matrilineal communities. So we have just a moment to go, and I'll just ask if there's anything in closing that any of the panelists might want to say before I draw us to a conclusion.
I to just jump up on what Sucharita said. Yes, there is indeed, I think, and it's quite surprising because you think motherhood and religion, you tend to have indeed traditional, if not outright conservative, so to speak, readings. But in fact, when you look, you dig a little bit deeper, you will find that looking at religions is a great way to queering, so to speak, motherhood. To some extent, of course, there are limitations to that. And one thing I want to say in conclusion is that we paid lots of attention as scholars of how we define religion. What is religion? And can we apply, for instance, Western categories of religion to other traditions from a Western perspective, of course. There's a lot of work to do here as well to how we define motherhood, and to that also working comparatively, and in that work by Julia was really inspiring. In Greece, you speak of kourotrophia. So that's the idea of nourishing the kouros, the young boy or girl.
Making the child grow. Precisely.
Making the child
not necessarily
grow.
The boy. Kouros is a boy, but
Kouros, yeah. So it's both, and it's centered on the person who receives the work, the growth, but not on the person who is performing the work. So that's also a shift in the perspective of how we look at this, of how we consider motherhood as work. So I'll hand it over to Pascal if she wants to say more.
Well, actually, I wanted to just add something. I mean, the collaborative project is something that is not always easy to pull together because we have so many different things to do, and I want to actually recognize Florence's work here, because she's been like an amazing leader. You don't have to blush there, but it's true. I mean, she brought us together. She kept us on track. She ran, as she explained earlier, she ran all the technological aspects that I think most of us are like not able to deal with. And I really want to recognize her work, because that's something to keep in mind. It requires a lot of work, and it definitely requires someone who's very well organized and who's very motivating. And she definitely did that. So thank you, Florence. I'm sure everyone is going to agree with me on that.
Thank you, Florence.
Yes,
Absolutely.
and thank you to Florence for approaching us, Milda and I, about making this a topic of a webinar. I'll just say in closing that we continue to invite those kinds of ideas from our membership. It obviously produces a rich and a coherent topic of focus if this is an existing project, rather than something that we bring together for the purposes of the webinar. So we warmly invite those ideas. Milda and I, if all goes well with COVID and also with Ukraine, we'll be meeting in person soon to plot out our next set of webinars. So keep your eyes open for those opportunities. Thank you to the 4 panelists, Julia, Sucharita, Pascal, and Florence. And thank you also to participants for joining us live, and then those who might tune in on the YouTube channel later. We're really grateful to have you all. Keep sending us your ideas and feedback. We appreciate it.